What's up, guys? Steven Spikes here at the Spike Signal, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my probably favorite melodic death metal songs ever. It's the music theory behind Anterior's The Silent Divide off of the album This Age of Silence. That's coming up right now here on the Spike Signal. So getting straight into the tab, unfortunately this tab, the one I found, does not actually have bass attached to it. It's only the guitars. So, just going to have to kind of deal with that and do our best to make sense of what's going on here with that limitation in hand. That being said, when I listen to the song, I personally don't hear an overabundance of stuff that the bass is doing detached from what the rhythm guitar is doing anyways. So hopefully from a theoretical standpoint, my interpretation won't really be confounded by not having the bass in there. So disclaimers out of the way, let's go ahead and get into it right now. The first thing that I just wanted to point out is this song is in D minor. It's in D standard, in fact, as well. So the lowest note on the guitar is a D note, and we're basically playing the pattern that would be E minor, but we're down a whole step, so now we're in D minor. And we're just going to go ahead and play the first few riffs here and get back to talk about the theory behind it. Okay, so getting right to the first part, let me go ahead and get to it. You see right off the bat that this song, even though it's a melodic death metal song, it honestly sounds very almost metalcore in terms of the way things are being played. We have a lot of use of pedal tones on top of melody notes going, so you basically have this driving lower percussive beat going all the time in conjunction with the higher notes to give you a sound of movement and melody within the song itself to build the overall effect of the song. Within that stuff, we are going to heavily find ourselves, like most times, be focusing on the one chord of the minor scale. In this case, we're in D minor. We're going to find ourselves routinely revolving around D minor chord, the one of the D minor scale. And for this, we can see it right here. Going right there, continuing on, changing to the flat 6, and doing some interesting movements from there. So let's go ahead and look at what's happening on the sort of main riff guitar of the intro, we'll call it. So basically just kind of jumping back and forth between the 1 and the flat 7 note, the interval specifically themselves, adding in a little bit of triplet action right here, a little bit of pull-off stuff to give a little bit of swing and flow to the riff as it continues, and also harmonizing those sort of dancing lines on the other side of the speaker too, to give a lot of sort of intensity and craziness as the intro riff continues amongst all of these rests that you see right here. The whole song then transitions to the flat 6 chord, or in this case, it's the B flat chord, the Lydian chord, if you would, in order to give a lot of kind of anticipation and readiness to jump into the preceding riff with lots of intensity and lots of punch. As that B flat chord is going, you have the same sort of palm muted riff going, but in a different spot, now this time utilizing B flats right here in order to give the song still the driving feeling that the past pedal tone related riff was giving, but now sort of transposed into a sort of Lydian way of doing it. You can actually see they do hit the flat, or the sharp 4 right here, so it does have that sort of distinct Lydian sound to it. When you get into this part right here, it's pretty cool. You know, I attempted my best to just kind of figure out what chords were going on here and how to look at them. This isn't perfect interpretation by any means, but you can look at it. They basically play notes together. Both guitars are playing the same notes here. They kind of just sort of pick a root note right here. In this case, it's the A, and just sort of ascend up on the string beneath that slowly until they get to a power. They go from basically thirds all the way to a power chord, all the way to a flat 6 in this case. And then they jump up to what would then be the, again, the flat 6 interval in this scale. And they do basically the same sort of thing. They kind of ascend up. Here it's hanging out on a B, and I'll zoom in this for you guys. Here it's hanging out on a B. It jumps up to an E, and finally up to an F, all while the B is being played right there. So a little bit of an interesting thing. You could just kind of play straight power chords and ascend with it, but I like what they do here. Just another thing to add a little bit of interestingness and texture to a song that would otherwise kind of have a fairly basic ascension. It's turned into something that has a little more interesting of an ascension because they hang out on the same root note. So good stuff right there. Let's go ahead and I'm going to play the next part and we'll get back to discuss it after we get through it. All right, so what we see right here is essentially the same riff we heard in intro, but this time repeated with both guitars. The drums are going full force right now on the downbeats, playing along to things. We're on the 1, we then transition to the flat 6, before holding on what I would classify, assuming the bass is playing the same thing as this A right here, on what would essentially be kind of A chord with the 3rd played on one side of the stereo spectrum, before jumping into this really cool kind of like ascending solo upwards. These are of course playing thirds. I'm classifying this whole thing as a B minor chord, or I'm sorry, a B flat chord, because it starts on the B flat, on the flat 6. And all these notes right here on the upper guitar, all are thirds to these notes right up here. Fairly simple, but the way it's done in the context of everything else sounds absolutely awesome and freaking sick. Catchy too, which of course is one of Anterior to me's like main selling points. Super, super catchy. So let's go ahead and continue. So here we essentially have the riffs we've just been hearing again with a couple variations. Now the first variation, as you probably heard, is instead of returning to those sort of melodic notes, they instead stay and hang out on the pedal tones in this section in order to continue giving the guitar a little more of a percussive angle. This, I think, is a really good idea because at this point the vocals are coming in full force, the scream vocals are coming in, and by not totally filling up the verse with a lot of melodic notes, sticking closer to these pedal tones, I feel, and I don't mean this from like a production standpoint, but in terms of the arrangement, they kind of like pull back a little bit of intensity and they let the vocals come out just a little bit more. And I mean that from like a music theory, like hypothetical standpoint, opposed to like a production standpoint. But yeah, both guitars are doing the same thing. Then, now we also have this different part added here too, which is a similar thing as we saw prior. It's just kind of an ascension starting on the B flat, ascending up in triplet fashion into the Lydian part of the song, of the riff. Again, with the Lydian section kind of doing some more palm muted notes as well, not hitting all of the melodic tones and staying closer to the pedal tones, just to kind of, you know, metaphorically duck back things. One more thing I wanted to mention on this tab shows that these like triplets right here, it shows them as having a rest right here, so it sounds very kind of cut off and abrupt. In the actual song, I think it would probably look, in fact, more like this to be more accurate. That's all over the tab. Just keep that in mind as we going through this stuff right here. It sounds a little bit different functionally in the song than it's notated here. So let's go ahead and get to the next part. Transition. Okay, so going back to it, let's go ahead and see what we have here. We have the guitars kind of doing like something that would almost be akin to a breakdown, you might want to say, but not exactly because it's nowhere near the breakdown section of the song. It transitions from here into a power chord section where the drums kind of pull back in speed, and there's actually more kicks, drums than you hear in the actual tab here, so the kicks are still keeping quick with things here and there. But the snare and the cymbals, the crash, pull back some, and you kind of slow down for a bit, and you have this really cool power chord chug riff going on here with some slides to add intensity. You have the use of some cool rhythms right here, nothing too like elaborate or dramatic or unique, but it's still just in the context of everything ends up coming off as a really, really cool package. So in that section right here, we actually move down, and as the chugging riff continues, there's a quick break where they go ahead and they play some octave chords. They play some held chords lower on the neck, specifically implying a B flat and a C, which would be a flat 6 and a flat 7 respectively, while at the same time adding some octave chords over top. Like for example here, these octave chords represent a 5, a sharp 4, tapping into that Lydian sound again, back to a 5, over top the flat 6, and right here we see what is essentially a chord tone movements. As they play the C, the octave chord essentially plays a C chord tones themselves, ranging from the 5 to the 3 down to the 1. Very cohesive, very cool sounding, and at the same time, somehow to my ears, very unique sounding, even though that kind of stuff is done all the time. Maybe it's just because I've known this song forever, I don't know. But really cool kind of break right there from the chugging stuff, really kind of pulls you out of it and gives you a little bit of intense beauty to things, so to speak. So let's continue on from there. Okay, so getting into one of the many kind of back and forths between the pedal tones and the melody tones right here. Again, what they do here is very simple, but it has just enough uniqueness to it to make it sound really, really awesome. They are essentially, I would say, implying a flat 6 here because of the fact that they are utilizing B as a pedal tone, while at the same time, the third of B as, for the time being, anyways, for this measure, as one of the main notes they're hitting melodically. Adding in a little bit of that kind of pull-off action right there, hammer-on pull-off action, to give a little bit of flair and a little bit of sort of like spin to the riff, you might call it. A really cool movement they do that I think is worth pointing out, they do this at several points throughout the song, is the delicate sort of jump between triplets, eighth note triplets, to regular eighth notes. When you're hearing it, at least, you know, when I heard it before I really started getting into a lot of this stuff, it almost sounded like it was all kind of like one fluid movement, but it does slow down just a touch, of course, because these are eighth notes and not eighth note triplets, and it sounds so perfect and so good the way it's done here. You know, many bands do stuff like this, and it's really just a nice example of a way to flare things up, you know? Instead of sticking with straight eighth notes through the entire things, for one of the beats, go ahead and make them eighth note triplets, do a hammer on and pull off, do a little bit of thing to another note. It sounds really, really good and really, really cool. Okay, then for the vast majority of the next part, I interpret this whole thing as a D minor because they actually end up moving the pedal tone to the lowest note, the D, and as well with that, they actually have a D on top as well. So moves to D minor. So yeah, very, very similar to that last riff, but just changing that pedal tone really changes up the whole feel, and it works quite well. Now, the last measure of this section, again, we have the use of the triplet eighth notes and the regular eighth notes harmonized once again to thirds in order to give you a nice sort of unique, like stereo kind of thing with stuff. and just give you a really cool harmony on top of all the intensity. Very good. All right, so this riff actually employs a very similar thing as the last one we were just talking about. Let me go ahead and get to the front of it. What we see here is a case where we are still in D minor because the pedal tones now are an octave higher than the lowest note, but they're still on a D, and we actually see the threes right here, the flat threes of D minor as well. And we once again have third note harmonies. Now, this tab shows that the pedal tones themselves are in fact third note harmonies as well, to the extent that we have the D right up here as the pedal tones, the D note, and then we have the B flat right here in addition to that as pedal notes as well. I am not sure if that's accurate 100% to the tab, but for right now, we'll just talk as if it was. We have harmony there, as well as the harmony of the higher notes. So the melodic notes as well, we have third note harmonies. Looking at this now, if in fact this was right and the bass wasn't plain a D, we'd probably want to go ahead and interpret this as a B flat as a flat 6 instead of a 1 as a D minor. Again, that would come down to what the bass is playing. The bass might actually be playing a B flat, and if that is the case, this should definitely be a B flat of flat 6 instead. But given the limited information that I had here, I just kind of went with this. But, you know, if there is a tab you see out there that has the bass on it, that'd be a worthwhile thing to look at and to check, assuming it's correct and everything. So the melodic notes basically ascend ever so slightly, and then once again do the triplet eighth note thing for a good bit of spin. Then, just like the last riff we've looked at, it then transitions to where, and here the tab shows both guitars going to the lower D, to the open D, doing the same melody notes, but different pedal tones. Goes to show how just changing what is essentially one element, your pedal tone, can go a long way to totally changing the sound and the feel of the riff that you're creating. Very, very good tactic to use if you want to expand the diversity of your arrangement. Okay, we then move into the intense part. With the coming together of the pedal tones on the offbeats and the melody notes on the onbeats, and the drums ever increasing the frequency of the snare use, the double bass as well, what you have is a perfect concoction for a very, very intense and killer part of a song. Even though, once again, this part isn't technically all of that complex, it's still very powerful and smacks you all the same. I'm going to look at this whole thing in terms of D minor because our pedal tones are all D, and we have a lot of use of D minor as the melody notes as well, as can be seen right here, or D note, I should say, as can be seen right here, and so on from there. Once in a while, going to a hammer-on and pull-off harmonized movement, once again, just breaking things up ever so slightly, instead of constantly keeping this melody note, pedal tone beat over and over again. They changed up just a bit by something like that. And once again, it's those little touches, it's those little things that transcend the song from being something that sound rather stock and stale to something truly awesome. Okay, so from there, the whole song stops for a moment on the flat 6. Really cool little drum fill there. Then it gets back into the verse. So I'm going to move us forward just a little bit to talk about the next part where something different happens. We're going to go through this whole verse. First half of it anyways. Now, though it is not shown in the tab, what I hear when I hear this part of the song are these riffs right here as you see them, but the second guitar is playing the melodic notes a third higher in all cases. You don't see that here, but I'm damn near positive that I hear that in the song. So just keep that in mind too as we continue forward. The drums also chill out here a little bit too to give a little bit of a different feeling. Then you get into the transition that comes in directly before it goes back into the riff played in The Ghosts of Dawn. So this riff right here, once again, it's all harmonized to thirds. It's a cool little lick. Here you can see, according to this tab, there's more harmony based off of the pedal notes as well. Would have to listen back to the actual song to see if that's going on, but it is shown that way here. Then you get into the percussive part. Okay. So just wanted to talk a little bit about the implications of this section before we get into it. I'm going to go ahead and play the whole thing first. Okay. Almost to the solo, which is the big motherfucker part of the song. So the Ghost of Dawn part. Just looking at the rhythm guitar for a second, and again, we don't have the bass, so I'm just going to make all of my conclusions based off of implications based off of the rhythm guitar itself. So, looking at that, let me go ahead and bring it up real quick. What we have here, we start according to what we see here. We start in B flat, okay? The flat 6 right here. You see that right here? Moves to the C momentarily, right here, as can be seen right here, then goes to the D minor, as can be seen here. Spends a moment back at the C, at the flat 7, before going back to the B flat. That little outro part right there of the Ghost of Dawn section. What the lead lines are doing, once again, fairly straightforward, but the sum of the whole is a lot more than any of the individual parts. What the lead lines are doing are essentially playing harmonized thirds in track to what the lower rhythmic notes are doing. Specifically, these notes right here, these octave chords, are playing the flat 3 of the B flat. These octave chords right here are playing the 5 of B flat. You put those together, despite the rests in between the rhythmic notes, you essentially have a full chord. The 1, the 3 in the octave chords. Then you have the 5s in the rhythmic chords themselves, as can be seen by these Fs right here, or this 5 in the tab, as well as these notes right here. So that goes. The exact same thing is done here, and I'm not going to, get into every little bit of it, but basically the same thing is done here. You have a C implied. These octave chords are playing the 5. These octave chords are playing the flat 3. Same deal here when you get to the D. These octave chords are playing the 5. These octave chords are playing the flat 3. Then as it goes down, you have the same thing. There's a little bit of a jump right here, a little bit of oddity. I'm not sure if that actually is what happens in the song. This would be an implied octave chord of 2 right here. Like I said, might have to go back and double check that listening. But then it repeats. Then you have this little sort of outro part right here where once again these octave chords are playing the 5 and these are playing the 3 of what is implied down here, which are basically these combination of things. You have a D minor, a C, ending out on the B. On the Lydian chord, if you would, even though there's not technically a sharp 4 in here, but ending it out here in anticipation for the solo. Now to get into the solo. The solo is a fucking beast, man, let me tell you. So, first thing to talk about here, just wanted to give us a little bit of context about how we'll be interpreting the solo. Just going to look at the rhythm guitar for right now. Again, I'm taking my interpretations from that pretty much. We start in the flat 6, hold. Ascend quickly right in this measure. And the 4th measure of the song, momentarily to a C, then to a D minor. Then we just go back down, C momentarily, back to a B flat. So that's what we're going to have here for quite a bit of this solo. So let's go ahead, play through and talk about it. Now, I've done my best to notate important parts of the solo with extensions, as can be seen by this, for example, right here, this right here in the corner. That'd be an extension of what's written up here implied. Just go ahead and keep that in mind. If I don't talk about something specifically, it might be notated in here. So if you want to look at it, you can see that. But let's go ahead and listen to the first part of this solo. Okay. Again, the way the tab bending function works, Guitar Pro's bending function, it might not sound like perfectly accurate. It might sound like a little bit off or out of key. It's just a function of the tab. So this section right here, we have a little lick that is primarily chord tone soloing. Like many bands we've looked at, chord tone soloing is an ever-present theme. I'll point it out when I see it. Not going to go super detail and everything, but I will point it out when I see it. In this next measure, actually to the contrary of that, in this unique case, we actually have stuff outside of the chord tones, which is in this case the chord tone of B flat. Makes it sound very nice and, like, you know, it's hard to put like a word to the feeling it gives, but it does sound good, that's for sure. This is a mix right here. In this little section, this little movement, we have a few things within and outside of the chords. We have some ones right here to what's being implied. As soon as we jump to the C, we have some notes right within that. For example, we have the 1 of C. So kind of, once again, just staying kind of ducking in and out of chord tones. Want to point out in a kind of macro level fashion, very good use of quickness to subduedness when it comes to transitioning from the first 2 measures to the 3rd measure here. Before jumping back into a little bit of a faster part right here, to not write just a complete like shred for the first few lines of a solo, I think are really characteristic of making a solo iconic. So good job right there for sure. Okay, so again, trying to kind of stay with like the whole idea of keeping things like really catchy and really interesting versus just like a crazy solo shred fest. Not saying that like Anterior can't do that, because we'll see in a second they do. But we move to the D minor right here, and we see a bend. Then a few other licks, once again, as can be seen here, utilizing a lot of chord tones within that. You know, we have the flat 3, we have the 5, we have some stuff outside of that, but, you know, it's still kind of staying... It's revolving around a certain center of gravity, which is the D minor, the 1 chord in this case. Okay, so this next part is pretty interesting. Now, I think that the best way to look at this definitely is just to look at this thing as having an accidental in, because we are now back in the implied chord of B flat in the key of D minor. However, if you look right here, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on this thing real good. Let me go get to it. Right here, we have an accidental here. Now, I'll play it really quick for you. Now, that sounds so put together to me that I might not even like personally notice that if I was hearing it. What you can view that as is just simply as an accidental, or you could even view it as a 1 from the key of G minor, okay? So it depends on how you want to look at it, kind of back and forth on how I would look at it, but I would probably just view it as an accidental and nothing else other than that. So just something I wanted to point out right there. And yeah, just a little bit outside of the realm, but this note is borrowed from G minor. If you were interested on the circle of fifths, you can look at it and everything. So just a little nuance thing right there. Other than that, let's keep playing the shred part. Okay, so basically just a ascending line A cool pattern here. They go for, what is it, about 6, 7 notes ascending for the first part. They descend and just kind of continue going up. It's a unique pattern. It's fairly cool and everything. Once again, sounds very cohesive and unified despite borrowing an accidental. That accidental, by the way, is the only time that accidental appears in the solo, so it's an interesting choice, that's for sure. All right. So then we jump to a really, really cool, sticking very closely to the chord tones, cool little sweep section. Following the D minor. Almost entirely sticking towards the sweep section. Actually, yeah, this whole section is almost completely chord tones. Very unified right there. In this line, it's almost all chord tones. If we jump down, we then see that there is also this line playing, which are basically a third below what's being played above. So again, similar to how in my last video, All That Remains sometimes took lines and stacked parts underneath them. That same sort of thing is happening here. Just for that one part. And that kind of gets into something that's worth thinking about. One thing that's like just so common in all kinds of metal is at certain pivotal parts of a solo is to, instead of having one single guitar playing the solo down the middle, or maybe it's more than one, but basically it only sounds like one because it's all coming down the middle, is to throw out 2 guitars. Like you have a harmony, obviously, and to, instead of just keeping them down the middle, throw them out quite a ways, out on like the ends of the stereo spectrum in order to give some wideness to the solo and basically just give you a really unique effect. And, you know, if you're not listening for that, if you don't know what to listen to, you really might never notice that that's what's happening, but it unequivocally is one of the things that goes into giving a song like this such a unique and particular sound. And like in melodic death metal all over the place, this stuff is done on the regular. I'd almost say it's almost like a production requirement at a certain point because it is just such a common thing that's done. You're not required to do it, obviously, but it's a very common thing, and it definitely is an element that screams melodic death metal or intense metalcore or anything like that, you know? So yeah. Yeah, and that line right there, that's where they bring it back to one guitar. Okay, so we now get to the intense part right here. So this section is all B flat, all the way up to a certain portion, just a little bit up. Let's listen to it. For just 2 chords, it jumps to a flat 7 to the C for just a moment. Third chords here, I might point out, not power chords, but third chords. And over top of that, this lead line plays just a fairly like simple riff, but still just a super awesome one. And with how the drums are going, it sounds absolutely perfect and huge and awesome. You can see that the chords, based off of what is implied by the B flat chord, the extensions from this solo is shown as such. We have a 5, a 4, 3, and a 2. So not exactly like chord tone soloing at all. Still sounding very, very cool and freaking epic as hell. Probably partially, I'd say, because the whole solo is kind of based around the down note, the very first note, as seen right here, as being the 5, which is really good to just give a lot of like grabbing your attention sort of feel to it. When it's jumping to the C right here, you again have a lot of sort of within chord tone soloing stuff going on here, as well as a tapped line which functions as the 1 to C. This is a C note itself right here. Very, very cool stuff. Very, very on point. Very awesome. And that single tap note just like elevates the whole thing to a whole other level. So really, really love this line right here. Okay. You have this very nice kind of slower part, once again showing that like pulling back from intensity of a solo, the whole like ebb and flow thing, having insanity mixed with calmness and a more like restrained feeling, at least in the guitars anyways, is a very, very good balance when it comes to making cool freaking sick music, especially intense music like this. At the same time, though, you do have the double kick going very, very quickly, so that there is intensity there for sure. It starts again. Then this riff repeats as well, with this cool kind of like pentatonic thing right here, mostly pentatonic if not completely. This cool little line that goes here that utilizes some tapping and some sliding and everything, or even if you want to do it a certain way, tapping with 2 fingers on this hand instead of just one in order to play the whip. There's a couple different ways to do it. Pretty cool stuff though right here as it gets into the next part of the solo. Okay, so a lot of stuff to break down right there. So we now get into a different rhythmic section. 1, flat 7, to the flat 6, to the flat 3 for a moment. So different sort of melodic or a rhythmic line going there, actually. The lead line is all just doing power chords, and I have the extensions that they would be applying to the respective implication, in this case D minor, shown as such. We have a flat 3 for these, goes to a 4, to a flat 3 for a few notes, down to a 2, and you can see them all right there, what they represent. As it gets to a C, a flat 6 right here, we hang out on the C notes, on C octave chords for a bit as the rhythm goes for C. It jumps to 2. And basically, as it jumps to the flat 6, you still have, you know, quite a bit of B flat notes here as well, with like kind of bent up and everything like that. So yeah, very, very closely following the stuff right here with octave chords. Very cool. I like the idea of using octave chords in solos. I don't hear like a ton of bands do them on the regular, but I think octave chords, even though you might think of them as maybe more of like a a rhythmic guitar line that you'd put on top of lower sort of like palm muted chords or something along those lines, I think they really, really do have their place in solo creation as well. So let's go ahead and get to the last part where there is an F, which is a flat 3. So you have another section here, well, where you have harmonies, and if I remember correctly, again, things are thrown out to the sides. You basically have the flat, or not the flat, but the F. And these things, these notes right here, are basically for the first 2 notes of this part on this measure. You have them playing Fs as well, just different octaves. And then eventually hitting a pinch harmonic at the end. And you have this line right here basically doing the same thing, just everything is a third above this line. So again, things are very unified. Things are almost entirely, I think, at this point in the song, all thirds, and might continue to say that way for the rest of it, come to think of it. But yeah, you have a lot of unification, a lot of cohesion between the riffs being played as it hits this F for the first time in the song. So let's keep going with it. So the same riff plays, we go from the 1 to the flat 7, the flat 6 to the flat 3. So let's go ahead and look at the solo in accordance with that. Have a lot of chord tone soloing right here. Have a mix of non-chord tone soloing and chord tone soloing here. This section right here is all chord tones, nothing but. We have a couple outside of chord tone soloing from here. We have another mix here of chord tones and non-chord tones. And then finally we have another shred upwards harmonized. So let's go back and everything and talk about things kind of in a little bit more of a general fashion. You have this shot with this very nice subdued part that has like some bends appropriately, putting in a little bit of slides. Then right here, I like this part. It sort of jumps up almost a complete octave, and it kind of jumps up and you start hearing some higher notes to kind of grab your attention. And it hits those last few notes. Then it goes back down a lot and does a little bit of an arpeggiation out of chord tones. Goes back down, and then it jumps right into the shred. That's done in thirds. Amazing solo, man. One of my favorites without a doubt. Like, solos like this just make me want to take like almost as much time to write a solo as I would write the rest of a song. I mean, it really goes to show how if you're thinking carefully about things, you can come up with something truly epic and truly magnificent, and something that really could, if you wanted to, stand alone as a whole, albeit very small song in itself. So really, really good stuff there. Let's go ahead and get to the post-solo section. All right, so we have some octave chords to talk about here. We're once again going from a flat 7 to a flat 6 to a flat to a C right here, back to a D. So let's go ahead, get all the way back. The octave chords are following the chord tones very closely. If you want to pause the video and look at it, you can see what chord tones they're playing specifically. You can also see that there are some harmonies amongst the octave chords themselves, which are shown as such as ones, as twos, as threes, and everything. If you want to see specifically what any of those harmonies are in conjunction with each other in relation to the implied chords, go ahead and pause the video. They should be annotated for you to take a look at. You again have this really cool kind of interesting thing right here, pentatonic related, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, movement, all once again utilizing third harmonies with the extensions shown above the implied C chord as such, before getting to kind of the chilled out, relaxed part of the song or you get into the fucking crushing part. Now, in this part of the song, you'll see the chord implications up top, and you'll see these notes that begin on each chord tone changing, but the 4/8 notes that are before that, the harmonized ones, they'll be consistent each time. So we'll just go ahead and listen to this part. I'm not going to like verbally discuss it too much, but let's listen to this part and just keep those things in mind as we look at what's happening here. Okay, then we're about to get into the fucking breakdown, man. I wish all breakdowns were like this, man. This is like the perfect way to do a freaking breakdown, in my opinion. So we go to the minor, and that should actually be a B flat, not a D minor. So it goes to the flat 6. You have this little action right here where you have some nice harmonized like high parts really quick before getting into a little riff that involves a little bit of chromaticism, borrowing the B natural from outside the key to give it an extra bit of crushing sound right here before getting into the crushing palm muted breakdown. All right. So as you can see, not too much to talk about from a music theory standpoint there. I will just say, though, that this part of the song really utilizes like crazy the whole idea of combining the exact same notes of a guitar, a bass, and the kick and all that kind of stuff, as well as some cymbal in a very specific, tight, compacted fashion to give you an absolutely crushing and percussive punch to what's going on there. Again, very simple from a music theory standpoint. To get that tightness, though, is a very, very cool feat of production. It's done all the time in certain bands. Some bands literally are littered with stuff like this everywhere, and it sounds cool for them and all that stuff. It is cool to hear something like this in a melodic death metal song. I don't think the vast majority of melodic death metal songs that I've heard have breakdowns like this, so really happy and tight to see it here and to be able to talk about one. So I'm going to move past this repeating part right here and jump over to this next section. Oh, one more thing about it. This has like a lot of rests in it in between the triplets. Once again, I'd say instead of the last 16th note being a 16th note, it would actually be an 8th note. I think all of them should look more like this because there's not it's not like edited to be that cut off in the actual track. So just a quick note right there. Moving on though, let's go ahead and get to the next part. Okay, so at this point, the vocals come back and everything, still very powerful. Utilizes an out of key B natural here, once again, just to give a little bit of intensity. Typically, if you want some distress or some extra intensity, some dissonance, you'll want to grab from outside of the key, and that's what they've done here. They've used that B natural. Okay. So now I'm just going to play this part once again. You can go ahead and see what chords are being implied here, along with the accompanying extensions from the octave chords beneath, what they represent in relation to the chords here. Okay, so then we crush back into the main riff. So I'm just going to go ahead and play that reintroduction part. You then have what I believe to be like sort of an inversion of the ascension triplet riff we had before that was harmonized, where instead of ascending, you're falling down what are literally the exact same notes. So really, really awesome way to bring back in a riff that you heard before. It's just to basically invert, and I don't mean like invert like chords, but just sort of almost transpose, maybe if you'd want to look at it that way, a riff in order to reintroduce an idea that you had in the past that was really, really cool. And then it all stops for just a moment, a final crushing hit on the B minor chord, I believe it is, or actually it's the D chord on the minor chord. Yep, on the D before getting back into the main riff. At this point in time, when I hear the song, I hear third note harmonies played higher than what you have here, just like we had at the end of this last riff before the Ghost of Dawn interlude. We go back into this part, played exactly how it was before. We then go into the harmonized percussive section. Once again, we have some harmonies here. We have some moving between the B flat and the D minor based on the pedal tones. And then we return to the Ghost of Dawn section. I didn't notate any of this because the music theory of it's all exactly the same as we saw prior. We then have this sort of outro section. Once again, I'm just going to play it. You can see the extensions that are implied here. You can see the implications here and the extensions implied here. This part might be just a little bit off from the actual song, but I think it's fairly close. You have the same sort of riff we heard right before the first time the Ghosts of Dawn section came up, and then you have it end off on the D minor. Yeah. Powerhouse of a song, man. I particularly love this song so much because, and I'm sure there are plenty of songs that, you could find like this, but just in what I've listened to from melodic death metal, the melodic death metal that I found that I loved, I haven't found music in melodic death metal that's consistently as long as a lot of Anterior stuff, especially off of their first album. This really goes to show that even amongst a style like melodic death metal, where typically you have a lot of really cool riffs compacted within a rather formulaic structure, you can break out of that. You can add all kinds of interludes. You can add all kinds of whole different ideas. You can add, you know, intros you had at the start of your song initially into your stuff, and really just lend to a complete and amazing experience overall of listening. So it's really good stuff there. I feel Anterior in some ways, even though perhaps by today's standards, their stuff maybe is a little bit like more simplistic in some fashions. You know, you got to remember this album came out in 2007. I mean, that was over a decade ago. So at the time, you know, bands like Soilwork were already out then, but it was still really interesting stuff. And for the people that I knew that listened to metal, whenever I showed them this, they always found it to be really interesting. Even if they really didn't like the style, they still found it to be really interesting and creative and cool, because there's so many like techniques utilized here from a standpoint of composition that make it as such. So really happy to have looked at this. Hope you guys got some good stuff out of this. If y'all wouldn't mind, and you don't have to, but if you're okay to do it, I'd appreciate y'all checking out one of my songs I just put out on Spotify. It's called Celestial Fray. You can find it by typing in Spotify my name, Spike Signal, just like you see it here on YouTube. If you want to let me know what you think of it, I'd greatly appreciate it. But if you don't want to, totally fine too. I ain't gonna judge. I hope you guys got something out of this, and if you like what you say here, go ahead and keep it right here at the Spike Signal to see more. Thank you.